Good evening. My name is Bruce Pursley, and I am the chairman of the board of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. A warm welcome to all of you for the Second Stone Social Impact Forum. This is a special series that highlights civic change agents who advance social change and innovatively address areas of inequality in our society. Although we wish we could gather in person at our spectacular replica of the United States Senate chamber, I'm pleased that one of the benefits of virtual space is that we're able to draw in friends from all over the country who are visiting with us tonight. For those of you who are familiar with the Kennedy Institute's work, we welcome you back. For those who are new, the Institute is dedicated to educating about the important role of the United States Senate in our government, encouraging participatory democracy, invigorating social discourse, and inspiring the next generation of citizens and leaders to engage in the civic life of our communities. We believe that fulfilling this mission has never been more important than today. Our democracy is going through an unusual period. Our challenges are great, and we are so thankful to our partners who join us here in doing this work. First, I would like to thank our partners at the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, with Rachel Floor leading as executive director, and for their collaboration in this program and many other aspects of our work in civic education. We are specifically grateful for the tremendous support for our wonderful sponsors of this program, the James N. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation. Their engagement makes it possible for us to bring compelling voices with important stories to our audience this year. And those audience happen to be national in scope. Jim and Kathy are passionate advocates for a more inclusive society, for civic education, civic engagement, and understanding that our civic engagement is an essential safeguard for our democracy. We are deeply grateful for their support for the Institute and the library and for making tonight possible. Vicki Kennedy is incredibly sorry she cannot be here tonight, but she has a wonderful excuse. She is in Germany with her daughter, Caroline, who just gave birth to a baby girl named Anna. And I know how much she wanted to be here tonight, but we wish her and her new granddaughter well, and she sends her regards to all of you. As the United States rejoins the Paris Agreement and the world continues our struggle to prevent rising temperatures and the effects of climate change, which is not always rising temperatures, it can feel like the scope of our crisis is so great, it is hard to see if it can be solved. But if we don't understand climate change, environmental justice, and social equity as issues that persist on a local level, how will we be able to take the steps to change what is happening and how it is affecting all segments of our society? It is critical that we elevate the voices of those who are working on the ground to tackle these issues, who do see the gigantic challenges as actionable on a local level. This is where we all draw inspiration from those like our speaker tonight, who saw an issue, looked to understand it from all sides, no matter how large, rolled up her sleeves, and is making change actually happen. It is now my honor to welcome our featured speaker this evening, Catherine Coleman Flowers, an acclaimed environmental activist, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and author of Waste: One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret. Catherine is also the founding director of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. She has dedicated her career to improving the health and living conditions of low-income rural Americans by exposing health and economic disparities, structural poverty, and the devastating effects this continues to have on people's lives. Parenthetically, what is happening in Texas today is having an absolute disproportionate to those who are at the lower end of the income scale. She also works to amplify voices of change through the lens of environmental justice. Additionally, she is the Rural Development Manager for Equal Justice Initiative, a senior fellow for the Center of Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, and a member of the Board of Directors of Climate Reality Project and the National Resources Defense Council. Joining Catherine tonight as moderator is acclaimed author and investigative journalist, Jeff Goodell. Jeff is a New York Times bestselling author. He's a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. He's a contributing editor at Rolling Stone magazine. He is an expert on climate change, rising oceans, and humanity's relationship with our rapidly changing planet. I want to thank both Catherine and Jeff for joining us for this Stone Social Impact Forum at an incredibly critical time. I will now turn it over to Jeff to start this important conversation. Jeff?
Thank you so much, Bruce. Well, I am thrilled to be here. I am talking to you from Austin, Texas, from the safe confines of the wonderful Blanton Museum, where we have power and light, one of the few places in the city that does have power and light. It's been a wild 4 days here. I think everyone knows what's been happening in Texas, and it's made this conversation today, even more relevant than it would have been any other time. I'm totally thrilled, Catherine, to be here talking with you. I've been writing about and thinking about climate change for a long time, and I can tell all of you who are here joining us today that she is the real thing, that we're incredibly lucky to have this opportunity to talk with her and to hear her views on what's happening in our world right now on these big and urgent questions. Just to give you a sense of where things are going to go, Catherine's going to talk for a few minutes just to give us a kind of broad outline of what she's been thinking about. She and I are going to have talk for a little bit, and then we're going to invite questions from all of you, which you can send in through the chat, and I will then prompt Catherine to respond to. So with that, not wasting more time, Catherine, you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what's on your mind right now?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, the Edward Kennedy Institute, for inviting me to be a part of this forum, and thank you to the Stones for making it possible. I think I need to start off by talking about my background a little bit, and then what is going on now and why we're at a point where we have to be serious about dealing with climate change and climate justice. I'm a native of Lowndes County, Alabama, which is located between Selma and Montgomery. If anyone knows that history, it was very vital to the voting rights movement, and we realized that voting as a franchise is very essential to democracy. I had the opportunity to get involved as a young person, and during that time, I served as a Robert Kennedy Youth Fellow with the Robert Kennedy Memorial Foundation when I was 15, 16 years old, and had the opportunity to meet Senator Edward Kennedy. Actually, during the summer of 1975, I made a trip to Washington, D.C. to live at the home of the Hackett's, David and Judith Hackett. Dave was the director of the Robert Kennedy Memorial Foundation at the time. And my job was to learn how Capitol Hill functioned. A young person coming from Lowndes County, Alabama, which has its own brutal history of racial trauma, and going to Washington and seeing the possibilities and learning the possibilities. Part of that experience included going to visit Senator Kennedy. He actually assigned someone to, there were two of us that were there that summer, and he assigned someone to be our guide while we were in Washington. And I just remember going to his office for the first time. I wasn't sure I actually dressed up to go that day, and I wasn't sure what to expect. And one of the things that made me feel warm and well received was looking on the wall and seeing the paintings and the drawings and the writings of his nieces and nephews. People wrote Uncle Ted, and I forgot that he was Senator Ted Kennedy. And it was one of those experiences that has always moved me because it helped me to understand the connection between what was happening in Lowndes County and what was happening in Congress, and what was happening in the Senate, and why it's important for us to understand civics and education. And I went on to become a history teacher, and I taught junior high school students. And I taught them about, even when I was in Washington, D.C., and made sure that they learned the preamble to the Constitution and learned about the three branches of government, something that we take for granted that everybody knows, and they don't know. So at this particular point, as we deal with climate change, we deal with environmental justice, all of these lessons are coming to bear for us to find the solution. We're going to have to work together and work through government and work through these various institutions, dismantle what has created this crisis that we're in. But I have hope. And even growing up in Lowndes County, it was because of the Kennedys and what they talked about that made me feel that it was possible for us to have the change that was necessary. And I still feel that way today, and I feel like I've come full circle.
That's great, Catherine. Thanks. So, hearing what you just said and thinking about Lowndes County and where you came from, it's so interesting. I mean, you grew up and knew many of the civil rights pioneers, activists. You came directly out of that world, and here we are now engaged in another big fight that has much in common with the civil rights fight, but is different. How would you characterize the sort of climate and environmental justice fight that we're engaged in now to the civil rights fight and the civil rights movement, and to what you learned growing up in Alabama?
Oh, I think there's one and the same. I think it's the difference with the civil rights movement is that we were talking about people of color getting the right to vote and having some control over their destiny. With the climate movement, we're talking about all of us. and interestingly enough, the people that want to take away that right for us to decide whether or not we want to destroy our planet are doing it by trying to disenfranchise us. We're actually dealing with that. And I think that if we look at what happened in Georgia, one of my friends shared with me the people that contributed, made some massive contributions and infusions of money into that election prior to that senatorial race. And these were people that were part and parcel of what we're dealing with right now. They come from an industry that has exacerbated, climate change. So I think that we've kind of come full circle, but I think we can also learn from the civil rights movement. And I mean, I think it's no irony that one of the senators that was elected to the U.S. Senate from Georgia, came from the pulpit that Dr. King once had. I think that's a connection we can't fail to miss there. So we also have to, I think in terms of engagement in young people, it was SNCC that came into Lowndes County, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, came into Lowndes County and helped, not told the people what to do locally, but helped the people engage and helped them to learn their strength and their ability to be able to deal with what was going on at that time. You have to do the same thing when it comes to climate change, because the way the other side keeps winning is making people think that there is no other way, that this is inevitable, that we cannot change it. We have to show them that we can change it, and we can change it through all the process we're going to be talking about.
Yeah. So, one of the things that a lot of young activists especially, but activists who are fighting in the climate fights right now talk about is the problems of capitalism, right? I mean, and that was part of the civil rights fight, but not as centrally as it is now. And I wonder, you write about that in your wonderful book, which I recommend everyone purchase and read, about disenfranchisement in Alabama, and about the difficulty of the sort of government systems there to basically care about what was going on there, but also the sort of larger systemic racism that is built into our culture and into our, into the sort of corporate world. When you hear young climate activists today criticizing capitalism and saying we have to reform capitalism, how do you think about that?
I think about it the same way that I thought about it when I was a kid. One of the interesting things about being in the household of Dave and Judith Hackett was Dave Hackett talked about democratic socialism, and people are talking about it now like they heard it for the first time. So when Bernie Sanders says it's so radical, he was saying this back when I was a kid. We do have to reform capitalism because capitalism was built off the backs of enslaved people. And what we see happening over and over again is that those type of systems only make the problems worse. I think the difference now is that the people that are in charge, especially what we saw the last 4 years, that those people didn't care about anybody. They didn't mind infecting their own people with COVID. So, it wasn't like it wasn't just about Black people. It was the people that were coming out supporting them were being infected too, and they didn't care. That's what capitalism has wrought, and we need to change that. I think that we can have a different type of economic system. We can reform it. Hopefully we can reform it. I'm hopeful that we can reform it to where it is not based on a small percentage of people making all the profits and everybody else is working and sacrificing their lives just to live every day without having a living wage. Where we won't have people in Alabama that have to go to work in these factories so that everybody else can have all these conveniences, but they go in there with not making living wages, being exposed to COVID. If they get exposed to COVID, what is happening here is that if you go and test negative, you're not allowed to quarantine. You have to go back to work. If you go back to work, that means you do get it, then you infect everybody in your household. Because people are living in small homes, they can't socially distance. All of those things is like it compounds the structures that are put in place to keep people in a state of where they have to be subservient. And we need to change that because I think in order for us to have a productive society, we have to move away from not paying for labor. We have to pay people a living wage. We have to make sure that everybody has access to good food. We have to make sure that people have access to sustainable housing and infrastructure, because if we don't do that, then we're all at risk. If for nothing else, for people that thought they were safe, COVID has taught us that that's not true because it doesn't care what your zip code is. Yeah. And that's why we have to solve these problems.
What's really interesting talking with you and hearing you talk about this is, 10 years ago when I was writing about climate change and talking to activists covering climate marches and stuff, there wasn't really much of an environmental justice aspect to it. It was, there was a lot of argument about carbon prices and cap and trade and things like that. And there was arguments about, there was issues about coal plant pollution and things like that. But this broader social justice aspect of the fight today is relatively new. And you're the embodiment of this conversation about this sort of broadening of the implications of the climate crisis. I mean, why do you think it took us so long to get to this point? I mean, it's very peculiar to me that it feels like for 30 years all we talked about was carbon scrubbers on power plants, but we didn't really talk about wages and jobs and all the other things that come with this larger climate justice movement that we're talking about.
Because I think that one reason it took so long because we have to look at ourselves and the systems that we've been supporting. When I went to Cancer Alley, for example, I was taken on a trip through Cancer Alley by retired General Russell Honore. One of the things he said to me that really struck me and stayed with me after I left was that there's probably nothing in our homes where the raw products did not come from cancer. And I think what it's taken so long because we have to really look at what it means to be an environmental activist. Some people got engaged because they want to be able to enjoy public lands. It wasn't to make public lands available to everybody. Right. They want to be able to take their boats on the rivers or the oceans or whatever, and be able to enjoy all the things that came along with that kind of lifestyle. But what they didn't understand is that we can't protect that without protecting people too. And when I first got engaged, I remember I started seeing changes myself here in Alabama. When I moved back to Alabama, I remember I thought, wow, these palm trees are growing here. That didn't happen when I was growing up, so something is changing. And having been taught in middle school and teaching geography, I realized, well, we're seeing animals here that are generally in arid climates. I didn't see these animals when I was growing up. I didn't see armadillos in Alabama. And now I see them all the time. And coyotes too. Coyotes actually racing through my neighborhood. So that is how things were starting to change. It got to the point where you used to have 4 seasons. Now we really just have 1.5, maybe, because the only month that we're really going to have a lot of cold weather will probably be January. But then when the other night, when the temperature during the day was like 32, and the next day it was 52. And this weekend is going to be 70. Something is wrong. So we had to, I think when I first started talking to Al Gore about this and others, and especially his daughter, Corinna Gore, one of the things that I noticed is that people can't relate to a polar bear. Everybody can't do that. Of course, I would see a polar bear and it'll bother me. But I grew up in the Smokey the Bear generation. So to see anything that looks like Smokey the Bear crying about forest fires, that's going to resonate with me. But that's not going to resonate for people who are not part of the Smokey the Bear generation. We need to see people and how people are suffering as a result. And I think now that we see that and we are framing it through that lens, then other people can see themselves. And for me, the last example I want to give is when I went through Appalachia as part of the New Poor People's Campaign. I saw how they were blowing the tops off the mountains. That was scary.
Well,
we need to deal with environmental justice to get at the root of all.
It's interesting you say that, because it was seeing the mountaintop removals, the blasting of the mountains in West Virginia that really got me engaged in climate and energy stuff back in 2000 after election of George W. Bush. And, when there was this big comeback of coal, and that really started things for me. I want to ask you, about kind of where you feel like we are today with this sort of larger climate fight and the engagement of people. As you said, people are seeing changes all around them, right? We all know, what's happening here in Texas, right? I mean, I'm sitting here in Austin, and, we had 4 days of extreme frigid weather. The infrastructure here couldn't handle it. We had, gas pipelines freezing up. We had a 4-day blackout. We've had water pipes bursting. Clearly, we're not kind of ready for this changes that are coming our way. But, and I know that the Biden administration is very hopeful right now. I had a conversation with John Kerry just the other day, who's very hopeful about re-engaging with Paris and everything. But on the other hand, nothing much is changing very fast. And, we've seen 30 years of this climate fight, and we've made some progress here and there, and we're having better conversations about it now. But when you really look at the big picture, progress is very slow, especially given what we need to have happen. I'm wondering just like how you're feeling at this moment. We've had, after the 4 years of Trump and that whole nightmare, which we don't really need to go into, but obviously this is a kind of reset moment for the climate and environmental fight. How are you feeling about things right now?
Well, I'm feeling a lot better. I mean, there's still a lot of work to do. I'm feeling a lot better. I feel better because, we have a president that can say environmental justice. We have a president that said cancer out. I've never seen that before. So, and also even prior to his election, I just remember people in Alabama are starting to pay attention to the Public Service Commission. Before, people wouldn't look down ballot. They didn't realize that the Public Service Commission was setting a lot of these policies that impact climate change and whether or not we have access to renewable energy. We actually had a meeting This was in 2019 when the Public Service Commission, Alabama had one of the highest solar taxes in the country, and the Public Service Commission was meeting to change it and increase it. And they were so used to having these meetings and nobody showing up that they didn't expect there were so many people that showed up at that meeting to want to witness what was happening and to voice their dismay at what was happening, that they didn't have enough room for everybody. People were all out in the outer area, sitting in chairs, listening to what was going on. And I think that in a state like Alabama, that's like one of those come to Jesus moments, like in Georgia, with Georgia turning blue, that, we're going to have to do something a little different. So they'll probably either change the narrative or they're going to have to change. The other thing that gives me hope is what is happening on the local level. For people, they're not waiting for the state and they're not waiting for the power councils to keep dictating to them what to do. I'm hearing from HBCUs to say, look, we want to go green. We want solar roofs. We want solar rooftops on all of our buildings on campus. I didn't hear that 4 years ago. There are people that are, a lot of these towns are reaching out and saying, because they know I serve on that task force, and they're saying, what can we do? We want to be able to have a role in, in having cleaner energy right now. So for those reasons, I am hopeful. And I think that there are more people coming to the conversation than ever before. And these kinds of events like what just happened in Texas, oh my God, last year we had in our area, we probably had a historic year of hurricanes. And what people don't know is that when those hurricanes come ashore in the Gulf, although it hit in Lake Charles, Louisiana, we felt it here. I remember being in the hallway of my home when the winds were still hurricane force winds by the time they reached Montgomery, Alabama. This was just last year. So people are paying attention. And I think we have to be concerned about people trying to shift the narrative, because what I'm hearing, some people trying to say in Texas now that what happened in Texas was because of renewable energy.
Yeah.
But people are smarter than that.
People like the governor here saying that.
Yeah. Or like the mayor of the town who claimed people were whining and they had to fend for themselves. I mean, that's the type of leadership we don't need to have, because that's no leadership. But I'm hopeful because there are others that will wake up and will see that this is not working, especially if they spend another night or so without power or they can't use their toilets. It's going to have to change.
Yeah. I want to encourage all of you out there listening to us to send in your questions via chat, and I will kind of sort through some of them and ask them. Catherine, I want to ask one other thing that comes to mind when we're talking about this moment and what you were just saying. We're in this highly partisan moment where it's very difficult to have conversations sort of across the divide, and we have this sort of tribal politics that's evolving that just sometimes you feel like you're talking in an echo chamber to people who already believe what you believe. And I was reading your book, which again is so wonderful. And there's a moment in your book when you talk about after the 2000 election of the Bush-Gore election, and you talk about meeting a Black Bush supporter named Bob Woodson in Selma. And this sentence you wrote, I thought was really great. You wrote, after that first meeting, I made a conscious decision not to allow political differences to limit my ability to talk to people about issues, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about right now. And especially because Bob Woodson went on to become hugely influential in your life and that conversation. But tell me what you mean by that, about not allowing political differences to limit your ability, and how do you try to cross this partisan divide?
Well, first of all, I'm in a very red state. So, if I were to only talk to people that have the same political views that I do, and then there's some people that may support the party that I support, and we don't have the same views, about how to get to where we need to go. So what I try to do is find, and that's one of the things that come from, I think, growing up in the country and being a country girl, find some commonality. In Alabama, you can start a conversation over something as simple as football. And that happened to me once. I was actually, I was with, it's one of my roles to EJI. I was sent to find a church in Lowndes County where some people were lynching victims. Their bodies may have been there because they may have been buried in that church cemetery. So when I went there, I didn't know, I hadn't been to that church before. And I didn't know how far away it was. Lowndes County is 714 square miles, and I grew up there, but I hadn't been to that part of Lowndes County. And when I went there, I didn't get enough gas. So on my way back, I had to stop and get gas, and I only saw this one place that had a Confederate flag flying. So I decided, well, Catherine, you're gonna have to get this gas at the pump. So I went to the pump to pump the gas, and it didn't work. So I had to go inside. And when I went inside, I saw all these Confederate flags they had up, but they also had rifles. And then I looked around because I'm always surveying my surroundings, and I saw this. They were also Alabama things. So when I went to the register, the guy was standing there, and I mean, I'm the only person. I'm the only person. It's just he and I are in the are there. There's nobody else around. So I said to him, "You cheer for Alabama?" And he said, "All day long." So, you know, my cousin OJ plays for Alabama, OJ Howard. And he said, "We love OJ." So I told him that, you know, but I had to come in because my card wasn't working at the pump. He took my card. He said, "Let me go pump that gas for you." And he went out and pumped the gas for me. So I think what we have to do is spend as much time finding things that we have in common as we do spend finding things that are different. So that's what I try to do, whether it's talking about a grandchild. I mean, there's nobody who can talk about their grandchild and not feel something.
Yeah.
You know, or if they're a parent, or if it's something as simple as football, whether you're talking about Tom Brady, whether you're talking about someone else, you know. So I try to find some commonality and build from there. I have the easy conversations first, and then I figure out how I can have the hard conversations.
That's great. That's great. Let me get to some questions from our audience. Here's one question. What are the small steps you made within local government that, when you reflect, made the biggest impact towards your long-term goals? This is from a question from Amy.
I think the small step that I made with local government was for some of them starting to trust what I was doing. Because there are some local governments that don't want to acknowledge these problems. You know, they're between a rock and a hard place, because here they are trying to recruit businesses to come into their community, but they don't want people to know that they have a wastewater problem. You know, it's like a catch-22, which comes first, the chicken or the egg. So they have had to cope with this for a very, very long time, and they really didn't want me to talk about these. But we were never going to solve the problem somebody did not talk about. And I think that's the role of an activist, because we can say and do things that people in elected office cannot do. But it also gives them the power that they need to make the type of change that needs to be made. So it kind of empowers them, so to speak. So that was one of the things. I now have more support among local officials than I've had before. And I've also had a number of officials on the state level who have reached out to me as well. And then in addition to that, on the federal level, we've had a lot of policy that I'm seeing proposed policy coming out of this Congress has been because of the work that we've done. And even people within government, some of the bureaucrats that have been appointed to these positions have reached out. Today, I had the opportunity to speak to the Office of Water about wastewater. And one of the persons that I had engaged a few years ago on this, after I finished, when he was given the opportunity to make his statement to everybody that was heard the Zoom meeting, the first thing he did was acknowledge what I had said about wastewater. Because before, when people talk about water, you know, especially they talk about environmental justice, they thought about Flint only. They didn't think about Detroit and the shutoffs and the fact that people didn't have access to wastewater treatment. You shut the water off. But in a place like Lowndes County, there's no infrastructure. They didn't think about flushing the toilet and going out on top of ground or coming back in your house, you have a failing septic system. So now I think that has become more of a part of everybody's conversation. And that's because, and those are the obstacles that we've been able to push away and hopefully get closer to progress.
Right, oh, that's great. Here's an interesting question. You deal with this a little bit in your book, but I think it's interesting to reflect on here. This is from Lisa. How does your faith inform your activism and your work? Has it been a barrier to effective work?
Now, in the South, everybody claimed to be a Christian. So in the South, it has worked. But I think what personally how it's helped me is that because I come from a faith tradition where I accept that everybody is my brother or my sister, no matter who they call God or how they worship, whatever. That's my faith tradition. And where it's been helpful to me is that I had the opportunity. It goes back to your earlier question about being around people that were part of the civil rights movement. I've had the opportunity to kind of sit and learn about how they were able to face adversity or the possibility of being beaten or have dogs put on them or fire hoses, and they stop and pray. And I realized the power of prayer. In those moments when I get overwhelmed, or when I feel like, this is going to take a long time, I stop and pray. And somewhere along the way, I get some kind of vindication that I need to keep going. So one example of that faith was when I went to Wheaton College, and I talk about it in the book. I didn't know what Wheaton College was when I got invited. A student at Duke was responsible for me getting that invitation. When I got there and I saw they were praying in class, I'd never seen that before. I've always prayed in class, especially before I took a test, but nobody ever saw it. I did it silently. So here they were praying in class. And so I realized where I was, and I had a prepared speech. But when it was time for me to speak, what I did, I said, I'm going to put aside my speech and speak, as a Christian. And I think that whatever apprehension, and I talked about climate change and environmental justice, and whatever apprehension, this a campus that most people would say was very conservative, whatever apprehension they had, it melted away. And at the end of that, a student came to me and said, everybody needs to hear what you have to say. I want to interview you for the student newspaper. So that is, and I didn't know that was where, Billy Graham's body laid and stayed and stuff like that. I knew none of that before I went there. So, but I feel that my faith gives me the opportunity to go places and to walk in areas where I would normally fear, but I have no fear because I have faith.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And that kind of leads into another question here from Thea, which is, I think, really important. After all, sort of this fight for a livable planet is really about the future and about young people and about the world that they'll be living in. How would you guide young people to understand the connection between climate change and social impact or social justice? Do you have recommendations for resources, policies, legislation? So how do you think about, just to rephrase that a little bit, about, what kind of advice do you have for young people who are getting involved in climate and environmental activism?
Well, I think, first of all, to be engaged in your own community, look around. There is no state in the United States that does not have environmental justice issues. I think oftentimes, whatever something is in the news, people go to that area, they focus on that area. But look in your own communities and see where you can help, because I think people will welcome. Based on what I have seen from young people, especially last year, I feel that I can learn from young people. People that were out there marching during the pandemic, saying Black Lives Matter, were young people. The people that the former president used the military to scatter so he can go across the street and take a picture holding the Bible. Those were young people who came back the next day and were still out there. So I think I can, as an older person, that gives me so much hope. but I feel I can learn from young people. I think that my role at this point is just to offer advice when asked, because I think they know what to do. I think you have to trust your heart, follow your passion, find something that you believe in, and be willing to fight for it.
That's great. I have a question here about kind of a free speechy kind of question, I think. And it's, Rachel asks, could you speak more on the idea that when some do not want to address the problem and use fossil fuel, they are essentially taking away the voice of others? So I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think that what Rachel's asking is you know, the sort of right to speak out about fossil fuels, and you know, there's a sort of outspoken public debate about that, right? And how do you think about that from a sort of?
Well, the way I think about it is that we have other kinds of technologies that we can use other than fossil fuels, and we need to start investigating and using those. I think it's people see that and see that the false narratives that are out there are indeed false. More and more people will want to switch and want to be able to use. In terms of, you know, the fight around that, I think it's the fight for some people to still be at the top percent in terms of income in this country, because they want to create a monopoly they control. And I was very, very concerned once I was in a meeting of a high level group of people, the high level think tank, and someone said, the person they were kind of dismayed by the fact that they were fracking closer and closer to major populations and the possibility of causing earthquakes. And I was very concerned because there were people in that room that went on like that man didn't say what he said, and I couldn't sleep that night. So the next day when we gathered, I had to say what was on my mind. I knew that I was probably one of the few persons that was, and I knew I probably, actually, I said to them, I said to them, I probably won't get invited back, but I have to say this. I said, when he talked about fracking and the fact that they were fracking closer and closer to major population areas that could cause earthquakes, and y'all didn't skip a beat. Where is the humanity in this room? And, I never thought that people would hear me. But I think what happened is that those people that were sitting on their hands and didn't say anything started speaking up. And it caused a shift. And I do know that out of that respect, I developed some friends that I didn't know I had that were there at that meeting and have now become some of my biggest supporters. But I think we have to have these hard conversations. And for those people that don't want to acknowledge what fossil fuel does to our world, I think we have to look at it like this. Let's look at it as if the earth was a womb, which it is. And the fact that it is without this womb, none of us could live. And we cannot allow, if earth was a womb, and if there was a part of the earth that was cancerous, that would prevent the rest of us from living, what would we do? That's how we have to deal with fossil fuels.
So I'm interested in when I think that's really true and very profound. And I also know that when you talk about the things you're talking about and fracking and the dangers of fracking or coal mining and blowing up mountains and all that, you have to do something that I've had experience doing too, which is you have people who work in the industry saying, look, you're talking about renewable power, you want to put fossil fuels out of business, you're taking food off my family's table. I have a job in the fossil fuel industry. I work as a fracker, I work as a coal miner. I agree with you, we need to take care of the planet, we need to, transition to renewable power, all that's good. But right now I need a job. And my job is in the coal mine or fracking. And when you're out there talking about this, you're threatening my livelihood. what do you say in those kinds of situations?
I agree with them. I understand where they're coming from. Like the people that have to go to work and get exposed to COVID and then go home and expose their families. I understand that because we have an unfair economic system. That's why we need to reform capitalism. But I also believe we should have a just transition. And I think that those people should be the ones to be near the front of the lines, as long with the EJ communities, that have access to those good paying jobs that are going to come from renewable energy, that they should be retrained. And I think that when we talk about the kind of jobs they're going to have, the money they make, they shouldn't lose anything. I think we should talk in terms of them making the same kind of money that they're making now, so they can continue to support their family. And that is a that is a real concern. And I do believe in a just transition. We can't just go, and I know people, even when I was on that passport, there was debate among, because some people wanted to see change right now. Or I hear people that talk about, people that think that we should go all the way back to nature, like we were living in the Garden of Eden. That's not going to happen. But what we have to do is to look at how do we have the type of transition where families don't suffer, because it seems like every time we change from one thing to the other, it involves some suffering. It shouldn't have to be that way.
Yeah. So I think we're going to have time for maybe one more question. And I'm looking at the questions that are submitted here. And I think I'm going to try to paraphrase a question from Catherine about, covers a little bit about, she asked a little bit about, advice for young activists, which we talked a little bit about. And I want to reframe it a little bit and ask you, one of the things that's remarkable about you and about your experience is that you have this heritage back to the civil rights movement. You come from the outside, from rural communities. You talk about sort of, rural bias in a lot of these conversations, but you have a sort of much broader and bigger perspective about this fight and that we're all engaged in, and stuff that we're all thinking about. I know this kind of puts you on the spot a little bit, but I'm going to do it anyway because that's my job as a moderator. If you had to sum up the most important thing that you've learned as an activist in your time, as engaged in all of these fights, how would you sum that up?
The most important lesson I've learned is to listen. Who I'm talking to, listen. Because out of listening, I will learn something that could help me get to that person or help them to understand what I'm trying to explain. And I don't always try to explain things from my perspective. I hear something about their perspective, I can use that, help them see what I'm trying to get them to understand. So I think as an activist, the most important lesson we can learn. I have people calling me all the time. A person called me yesterday to tell me how I need to engage with stakeholders, solve the wastewater problem. But she also told me she has a wastewater problem. So then she wrote me after the conversation and she wanted to know, will I at least use what she proposed to me? And I said, let's do this. Why don't you pilot what you proposed to me and show me how it works? And then we'll see whether or not I can use it. Because I listened to her. But at the same time, I wasn't going to turn her off and say, look, I've already done all the things that you said. I listened. I knew she has a problem too. That's where she's coming. That's the only reason she reached out to me, because she has a problem as well. But at the same time, I did want to say to her, well, you were condescending to me because you assume that I don't know these things. But oftentimes when we have degrees, go into communities, we don't realize that the Miss Shugs of the world know more about this than we do because they're living in it every day. So when we go into these communities, or we're talking to young people, or we're talking to the elders, I think if we listen, we will each learn something. I think I never would have gotten a MacArthur Award had I not listened to the people in Lowndes County, had I not listened to people that answer my questions when I asked, could there be something here that American doctors are not trained? So listening, I think it's it's simple. And remember, I explain things because a certain way, because I have to talk to vast audiences. But I think that's one of the basic things that we can all do is listen and respect the people that are talking to us, whether we agree with them or not.
That's great. So I think that we're kind of out of time for questions, but if you have, if you want to make spend a few minutes with any closing remarks, anything you'd like to say to wrap this up, and then we'll turn it over to Carolyn and have to sadly bring this to an end. But we have a couple of minutes. Is there anything you'd like to say to sort of wrap up your thoughts in this conversation this evening?
Well, I really would like to thank everybody that took the time out, because you could have been doing something else this evening. So I'd like to thank everybody for that. For those who have reached out to me and told me that they received the book, thank you. Please read it. And if you have any questions, I am available through Instagram. I do respond. Twitter, I respond there as well. Facebook. Reach out to me, and I would like if there's anyone out there who would like to be a part of our efforts to document the wastewater problem. I know there's a wastewater problem in Massachusetts too. There's one in each of the 50 states. So if you want to work with us, especially young people, we're going to provide some opportunities this summer to do that. So I'm looking to hear from you and expect a response. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. Carolyn, you want to close this out for us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Catherine and Jeff, for both sharing your stories and inspiring us all to call out change where it is needed and to take action. We're so pleased that you could be a part of the Stone Social Impact Forum. We again thank the support of the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation, who made this all possible, and our partners at the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. So until the next time that we gather, please keep safe. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.